Let's face it, our calendar is weird. I mean, months are kind of based on moon cycles, but not really. And they're kind of all the same number of days, but not really. And wait, why is February just different than all the others? I'm George, I'm a science teacher, and I'm going to tell you the story of where our calendar comes from. And I promise, it's crazier than you think. You may have noticed that the last 4 months of the year are literally named for numbers in Latin: September, October, November, December. Problem is, September isn't the seventh month, October isn't the eighth. So, why did they name them that? The short answer is that our system is Roman and that it's really old. It wasn't easy for early Romans to figure out how to make a calendar, so they tried out a whole bunch of systems until they ultimately found one that worked. Today's names and numbers are a mashup of things from those old systems. So in order to understand our calendar, we need to understand the history of where those things came from. Let's start at the beginning with the very first Roman calendar created sometime around the founding of Rome itself. At that time, the Roman calendar only had 10 months, each of which had roughly 30 days. Now, if you're wondering how that math checks out, get this. The Romans ignored winter completely. Now, if that seems crazy, remember that it was the 8th century BC and culture surrounded farming and warfare. In the winter, farmers weren't farming, and it was too difficult to feed and shelter soldiers, so martial activity stopped as well. The whole season was considered unlucky and bad, and so they just didn't count it. Then when spring returned, they declared a new year. They could go to war again, and so for luck, they named the first month after their god of war, Mars. April came second, and while the origin of the name isn't 100% clear, scholars tend to agree that it likely came from the Latin word meaning to open, which is what the flowers and the trees were doing around that time of the year in central Italy. May was named for Maia, the goddess of springtime and growth, and after that came Juno, who is the goddess of marriage and women. And so the first 4 months of the Roman calendar bear deeply culturally significant names that represent a society's love for springtime. And after that, the Romans promptly dropped all creativity and just went ahead and named the rest of their months for whatever number they were in the list. Now, if you're wondering how a calendar with a dead period in it functioned in a society, it absolutely did not. In fact, this calendar system was pretty much a disaster from day one. And so the second Roman king began counting the winter, and that's how we got January and February. And that's actually why the numbering problem in our calendar exists in the first place. See, when January and February were added, they were added to the end, so September was still the seventh month, so they didn't have to change the names. But centuries later, someone made a political play to move the beginning of the calendar to January so that elected officials could start their terms 2 months sooner. And just like that, January became the first month, February became the second, and the numbered months were shoved 2 places forward. And no one ever fixed the names. As for the new months, the first was named after Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings and endings, and the second month inherited all the unluckiness of wintertime. See, at the end of each winter, the Romans performed a set of cleansing rituals that they called Februalia. The name comes from the Latin word to cleanse, and it was a time of atonement, honoring the dead, and kind of cleansing the soul before you could move on in the spring. For this reason, February was considered to be the unluckiest month. From then on, it became the dumping ground for all the unwanted bureaucracy of calendaring that happens during the year. Now, let's look at why months have the number of days that they do. As you may have guessed from its name or its general length, the month used to be tied to the movement of the moon and not actually the Earth around the sun. Months were assigned either 29 or 31 days because even numbers were considered unlucky in Roman culture. One synodic lunar year is actually 354 days, so their calendar had to be shortened a bit. But again, even numbers were unlucky, so they only removed 1 day. Guess which month they chose to take the hit? But do you see the problem with this system? The Earth takes about 365 and a quarter days to orbit the sun, and since the seasons follow the sun and not the moon, the seasons drifted through their calendar by about 10 days each year. This was a disaster because many of their holidays and traditions were actually seasonal. Imagine having a harvest festival in the middle of winter when you barely have any food. This is where intercalation, or a concept you call leap years, originally came from. Except because their calendar was so far off an actual year, they needed a whole month and not just a day. That's right, there used to be a 13th month to the calendar, which they called Mercedonius. And it was a month that they inserted in the middle of February. Not at the beginning, not at the end of February, right in the middle, on February 23rd. Crazily enough, at this point in time, the Romans hadn't actually figured out the length of a year, so they gave the power to their leaders to insert Mercedonius whenever the calendar just kind of felt off. Problem is, these people were politicians, and politicians act like, well, politicians. Naturally, the calendar became a political tool, and they could add or subtract Mercedonius if they needed to rush or delay court proceedings, or even just extend their own political terms. And so dawned an era of confusion in which Romans couldn't agree on what day of the month it was. Finally came reason. Julius Caesar hopped across the Mediterranean to Africa, where Cleopatra was running things in Egypt.
What's up?
In Egypt, Caesar learned a simple yet revolutionary idea that the Egyptians had been using for ages. Despite the origin of the months, the calendar didn't have to be tied to moon cycles and instead should be tied to cycles of the sun, which, as we know, are 365.25 days in a year. Now, this sounds simple, but to a Roman, this was an absolute game changer. And so Caesar returned to Rome and promptly reformed the calendar. He abolished Mercedonius, added 10 days to the calendar, redistributing them across the year by lengthening several months that only had 29 days. And alas, we got the calendar that we still use today. To honor this achievement, the Senate voted to rename Julius Caesar's birth month to his own name, which is still why we call it July today. And then they promptly murdered him. The next Caesar to take power, Augustus, thought it was pretty cool that Julius had a month named after him, and so he demanded the same thing happen for him as well, which is how we ended up with August instead of Sextilis. And that's the story of where our calendar comes from. So, now you know the story of our calendar and all the work it took to make it, and if anyone asks you where you learned, you can just say, George told me.